Yes, hello everybody. I'm very honored to be here at this nice event of Siemens, open source at Siemens. That's very interesting and great. I like when big companies, known brands like Siemens, really push also open source as a topic. So I'm very much looking forward for this presentation. My name is Matthias Stürmer. I am, let me check how I can advance the slides. I am working at the University of Berne since many years, actually researching about open source software. I actually started with my master's thesis, you would say today, about open source community building 15 or more than 15 years ago. Then I went to the ETH Zurich for a PhD about open source, and I worked as a open source consultant at Ernst & Young and Leap, and I'm doing open source research at Uni Berne. So I'm all about open source and looking forward also to this presentation and to your feedback. Frankly, I'm leaving university part of it because I will join Berne Fachhochschule, Berne University of Applied Sciences in July, but I will still do open source research. I'm also part of the CH Open now since like many years and now president of this association. And we're a group of about 25 people right now at University of Berne. We do research and also teaching, about lecturing, about open source, about also ICT procurement, lots of different things. We build up platforms, prototypes, and everything, of course, with open source software. Now, what I'm going to talk about open source today. So first, I'll show you some trends or some insights about using open source. Second, I will explain to you what is releasing open source, how do companies and also governments release open source, contribute to open source. Then we will have a short look at inner source. What is inner source? I would like to ask you, do you know about inner source? But I cannot see your feedback, so please maybe respond in the chat and I will get the update later. And then we'll make a short outlook at what's next. So what could you do now if you are also all fascinated about open source and inner source? So I watched the presentations before and they were very interesting on a technical level. Now I'll try to leave a little bit the technical level and focus on more on a big picture, saying like how can companies benefit from open source software? And here I would like to use a graph which I received from Marco Stide. He's from the Baloise Insurance, maybe also watching right now the presentation. And he always uses this graph, and I like it a lot because I think it explains well what is open source actually, different forms of open source use. And so you probably are not on the denial level because otherwise you wouldn't be joining this presentation. I definitely think you will be on the use level at least. And this is what I will focus now in the next few slides. Later on, I will look at the contribute, champion, and even strategic investment level. And this is actually all also the sequence of my presentation today. Now, use of open source. How can you use open source? We don't start using IT from the green grass, how we say, green Fläche in English, I don't know, green grass flat. Anyway, so you won't start with any IT, but you usually start out with some existing IT infrastructure, and then you want to leave maybe this proprietary level, and therefore I'll have a very short look at this one very famous project from the CERN. You definitely all know the CERN, this huge center about nuclear physics, and they actually were confronted by very much increasing licensing fees of Microsoft a few years ago. And therefore they said, well, this cannot be true. We don't want to be stuck in this vendor lock-in, and we want to leave as much Microsoft products as possible. Well, Microsoft does open source today, so I'm very much aware of that. But just to see like what do they want to leave. They want to leave the very classical things like office automation, office products, or email or client software and so on. So therefore, they actually created this MALT project. The MALT project is because it's Microsoft Alternatives, and you can watch actually the announcement here and also more of the details on this MALT CERN website. I think it's one of the biggest moving away of Microsoft projects at the moment. You probably have heard of Munich, who actually wanted to leave Microsoft and they switched back to Microsoft. Or recently in Berne, where I live, we had this school where actually the schools wanted to use open source, but then the teachers actually protested. So therefore, it's quite a challenge to actually move away from products, platforms like Microsoft, because they're very smart on actually making you dependent on products. And actually everything is an ecosystem, everything is very tightly put together. So if you use Teams and then you use Microsoft Office and then you use SharePoint and everything, and so it's quite difficult to actually leave this kind of cancer-like structure, but that CERN actually wants to do that, and I really much admire them for this big adventure. Now, how else can you use open source software? Open source software is much used in every industry branch where you can think of. So for example, Zalando, I like this graph because they make a tech radar. They make a tech radar of mostly open source technologies. This is the Tech Radar 2018. And then if we want to look at the 2020 Tech Radar, you see some movements. They actually also structure this along some different categories, the frameworks, the infrastructure, the languages, and also the data management. So it's less the client-like open source software usage, but more the server-side open source usage. And so therefore, actually, they benefit much about open source software from the server side. Now, what I'm now actually doing at the moment, I'm working on the new open source report. The open source report called Open Source Studie is quite a traditional document. I have here the 2018 document, and I'm working on the 2021 document. So we actually do a survey every 3 years in Switzerland with the companies and also the government agencies. How much do they use open source? Why do they use it? Why do they not use it? What are the problems with open source? So we actually are right now preparing all the details of this new study. You can actually see here the image or the front page of the study, of this report. As you can imagine, everything is about rocket science, open source Linux for rocket science, because you probably, if you're a tech addict as I am, you probably have followed all the Ingenuity drone experiments that like the NASA is doing right now on the Mars. And it's really fascinating because Ingenuity has Linux inside and much more open source software. You have heard probably of GitHub that they actually announced they have a badge. So if you have somehow contributed to this open source software in the Ingenuity drone, you actually are now on the Mars and also on Earth with some GitHub badge. Anyway, this is just kind of the branding, the nice part of open source, because we want to show and illustrate open source everywhere, even on the Mars missions from the NASA. So you can fly to Mars with open source. Now, to the more detailed, we actually compared the data, the usage of open source software with the 2018 report. And good news. We have some good news. I'll show you some sneak preview data from the report, which we will present actually on the 17th of June in Zurich. So hopefully we can do some apero there. Now, the good news is really that open source is on the rise, still on the rise. And very interestingly, this year we observed a much bigger trend in the broadness of the use of open source software. So we basically asked the people, there were 160 people plus minus who responded, how much open source do they use? And actually, we didn't use any CH open addresses to ask the open source addicts, do you use open source? No, we used Swiss ICT, like the biggest Swiss ICT association, to give us the addresses. So they with some privacy things, so we don't use them for anything else. But so we asked all the CTOs and CEOs of any IT company and also non-IT companies in Switzerland. And we ask them every 3 years. And so we see the trend, if it actually goes up or down in different areas. And one area is very interesting, and these are the heavy users. So the heavy users are the people who use more than 14 different categories open source software. So we ask them, do you use open source on the desktop, or for the server operating system, or for databases, or for identity and access management systems, as we have heard before. And so more than, or actually almost half of the people, 49% this year, responded that they use 15 or even more areas open source software. Before 2019, the value was 29%. So it almost doubled, which is quite a huge increase when we compare to other figures that we found out in this big survey. Another interesting part is, what is still the reason why do you use open source? So the number one reason is still, as in 2019, open standards. So it's not the cost argument. It's not the whatever argument there were like 20 different arguments. We asked them a lot of questions. So the number one reason is open standards. And I really liked the thought that actually interoperability is the key value of open source. And interoperability is part of the design of open source, because everything is open. Interoperability is in the heart of every open source software. So we can say interoperability by design. Open source is interoperability by design. Then another interesting insight, we actually asked the people who use open source for programming, for developing software, what kind of software languages do you use? So JavaScript is first, and then actually I think Java and Python and everything is quite normal. But there was one big winner in 2021. This was TypeScript. So TypeScript, you might have heard, is the language used in web development for the server side and also the client side. And it's typed, obviously, and it's typed JavaScript. So you really have to look at that, because in 2018, it was only at 2% of the people responded that they use TypeScript. Now it's 39%, so an increase of 40 times higher. Something you really have to look at. And there are more details. One more insight, I thought with the speaker before, he will be interested in this. So actually, unfortunately, not Citadel, but actually Keycloak was one of the big winners. But also the whole category of open source identity and access management tools, it advanced very much. So this is also very good news for Citadel, because now it's like clearly much more people use open source IAM than 3 years before. So the whole market increases. And within the market, Keycloak advanced a lot. It's now also almost half of the people who use open source IAM, they actually use Keycloak. Now let's see if Citadel, how it does. On oss-studio.ch on the website, I think it's very small here, you can watch the current study results, and part starting from from the 17th of June, you will see the 2021 results. Now, where can you go if you want to look for open source software? I can definitely recommend Alternative 2. So do you know Alternative 2? This is very simple, very huge portal website, which they list thousands, literally thousands of software. And you can say, I'm looking for an alternative to Adobe InDesign. So who would like to do a flyer for his party in the summer? You won't want to use Adobe InDesign because it's proprietary software. So therefore, you look for the alternative software. And here you see it, it's Scribbles. Scribus is used and loved by many others, and you can actually give a very short click. You have to filter for the open source alternatives, obviously. You don't want some freeware software or any other paid software, but if you filter it, then you actually find very good alternatives to open source software. You can find open source alternatives to proprietary software. Now, and this is very easy. You can give this link to your grandmother, and she will understand it and how to use it. So it's really end-user driven platform and very simple to use. A little bit more advanced platform I often use to understand more about when I want to use software, open source software, is OpenHub. OpenHub is from the company Black Duck, which was bought by Synopsys. So they actually have a list of 500,000 open source projects. And open source projects, usually they offer the source code, because otherwise bad practice. Huh? So they offer the source code on the internet, on GitHub or GitLab or any other platform. And what OpenHub does is actually they crawl the source code repository on and on and on. And so actually they can monitor how does a community evolve. And this is very interesting because you can see, first of all, like which are the most popular projects. Well, obviously this is a little bit biased because people have to click some stars, but then it's very kind of personal driven. But much more I like this comparison chart. You probably know Digitech. On the Digitech, you can compare different screens or keyboards or anything else. And here on Black Duck OpenHub, you can compare open source projects. And then you can add 3 open source projects, unfortunately only 3, but then you can compare them. And for example, content management system. So there are thousands of open source content management systems out there. So if you want to choose an open source content management system, you want to have one which has lots of developers, lots of contributors, a big community, a thriving community. So therefore, you want to look at WordPress, for example. WordPress is a very famous open source project. You will see in the Open Source Report 2021, it's still on the top used open source content management systems. Now you can see actually all-time statistics. There were actually 100 developers who have been developing, contributing to WordPress. Not so many. However, if you look at Typo 3, the other open source content management systems you probably have heard of, they are about 1,000 developers. So it has 10 times a bigger developer community, which I think is quite astonishing. Or also, if you look at 12-month statistics, WordPress had only 42 developers, contributors, while actually Typo 3, they had actually 127 developers. However, on the WordPress statistics, you see they had 4,500 commits, while on Typo 3, there were only 1,400 commits. On the other hand, there were a lot of big contributors by the Drupal community. However, here the repository is not updated, so probably the numbers are not very accurate. Anyway, you understand the principle, and so you can actually compare different open source projects with each other, and therefore I really think this is a very good platform to assess the quality of the community and the flow of development. You actually can check if your open source project is on there. So it's 500,000 open source projects out there. So there are lots of data out there. So therefore, that's a nice platform. Now, this is everything about, well, not everything, it's just an insight. It's a very short insight about using open source software. Second chapter of my presentation is about releasing open source software. So you remember the chart we had from the Eclipse Foundation? Eclipse Foundation, obviously, they are all about releasing open source software, and even in our strategic investment. So let's say releasing can be you want to contribute some patch, some improvements to an existing open source project, or you can be a champion, whatever this means, and then you can actually start your new open source initiatives, your new open source projects, where actually the business is also driving this, because there needs to be some business benefits if you want to really start a new open source project. So this is very interesting because here actually we get to the heart of open source development. One of the key questions in open source research was always, why do individuals develop open source software? So this is the micro level. It's not about why do companies contribute to open source, because it's the macro level. This is about business models of companies. The motivation of developers is about individual perspective. And here actually it's very simple. You have this intrinsic motivation and you have extrinsic motivation. So you can say basically on the left side, there are people driven by ideology. People from the Free Software Foundation movement, for example. They believe, Richard Stallman and his friends, they believe open software should be always open or free, of course, not open. Don't say open to him, so he will kill you. He did almost kill me. Anyway, so this is the very left part. So people contribute out of ideological reasons. Then they contribute because of altruism. They want to help someone, actually helping someone with his problems. And then there are people who actually have kinship motivation, meaning they want to be part of a community, of a group of people they belong to. So the Debian developers are the Debian family, or the Firefox community is the Firefox family, and so on. Then there are people who just have fun, actually fun programming on the weekend, while others go hiking, they do programming. Then there are people who do it for reputational reasons. And here you see it's already getting closer to extrinsic motivation. It's in the literature, you call it internalized extrinsic motivation. And then there's reciprocity. Reciprocity means you want to give back something because you received a lot of open source software, you want to give back. And then there is learning benefits. People learn a lot of new technologies and programming languages and libraries. Then there are people who love to use open source because it's just beneficial for them to program a component, and there's no much effort to release the software. Then there is career people who want to get a nice job offer from Google or Facebook if they contribute to some famous open source project like Linux. And then there's regular reasons for pay, so you receive money and then you're paid, and everything is good. So the point is that people who contribute to open source software, they're not just in one of these 10 categories, but actually they are usually in different ones. So people, let's say at Siemens, they're maybe employed for programming open source software, so they get paid. But the guys I know behind the camera of the Siemens event today, they're much more than just paid by open source, by the company, but they actually do it with lots of fun, with lots of kinship, with lots of ideology and so on. So there's a mixture of different reasons and why actually people contribute to open source projects. So this is one of the famous research papers of my doctoral PhD supervisor, Georg von Krog. So they actually analyzed 30 different papers, publications, academic studies about motivations of open source developers. So they did this meta-analysis, and therefore I think this is quite solid research. Now, if you want to get a community running, so you really have to understand what is the motivation of my people, of my community, what do actually what drives this community, and why do people actually spend their time on the platform? Is it because they are paid so basically there are companies or government agencies behind it? Or do they do it for hobby reasons, which is not bad at all. It's very good, but it's just different. So if you want to actually get a community growing, you need to understand these dynamics. And if you want to release software also within a big company, you have to understand why do people within the company contribute to open source. A second thing you definitely have to understand is all the different structures of open source communities. So another paper I can recommend is by Kilamo and his colleagues. They actually research about the ecosystem of communities. So you probably have heard of the onion model of open source communities. And therefore, there are project leaders within the core of a community, and then there are core members and active developers and so on. So there's an onion structure in every open source project. And then there are also community activities. So if you have an open source project like Citadel, I recommend to you plan your activities around your community. So you should have actually different work packages within this community. So you need to do legal issues, you need to community management, you need to do development processes, infrastructure, software development, marketing. So there are different aspects you need to look at. And then there is one research paper we did a few years ago about governance of communities. So are they completely independent communities like the Geneva community we researched? So this is completely independent open source community, or do you actually want to join an existing foundation or umbrella organization like the Eclipse Foundation or the Apache Foundation or the Linux Foundation? And there are also some intermediary approaches where you can have actually some services outsourced to platforms and communities like software in the public interest and so on. So there's different aspects you have to look at. I put all the links or the paper references below here, so you should actually be aware of this research in open source, which I think is absolutely fascinating because I do it for many years now. Now we're open source at Siemens, so this is open source by Siemens. So Siemens actually does it very strategically. They have released 125 packages on GitHub already, and probably much more, because usually big companies like Siemens, they have even several organizational accounts. And I don't know, maybe we can talk later on with Max how Siemens actually organizes this. And then there are other companies I have looked at is a company Zalando. We have looked at them before. So Zalando, they have advanced a lot this idea of how do we do open source in our company. So they make it all transparent. So you can look at the Zalando's open source documentation, something I really can recommend because they have quite advanced policies. They do licensing. They ask if you release open source, you always have to think about licensing issues. So do you, if you start a new project, which license do you choose? There are lots of different licenses, about 100 different open source licenses, different terms and conditions. So basically, what open source license do you choose? Or if you want to contribute to an open source project, you need to be aware of different conditions of these existing open source licenses and so on. So actually, Zalando has a big thoughts put online. Unfortunately, that's not very updated at the moment, I think. So maybe they should update it again, but it's still very valid, I think. They also do strategic thoughts. So what software do we publish? What do we open up? And where do we not open up code? So for example, all these competing all the area where Zalando is competing with other companies about search and engine and search algorithms and preferencing and recommendation algorithms, they don't open that because it's very at their core strategic values they have, and so therefore they don't open it. But nevertheless, they have literally hundreds of open source projects released. So there's definitely something going on at Zalando. Another company I very much like because, as I mentioned, Markus Tide, he's a very active person, and also Matthias, his colleague, they also actually do a lot of open source in Balois, an insurance company. They have Balois open source guidelines, and they connect with the Zalando guidelines because it's all open. They cite them, and they also advance it. So in certain areas, I think it's even better advanced how Balois open sources their software. Now, after a while, I found that there are lots of different GitHub profiles out there in the internet of different companies, different governments, and so on. And so I thought this can I actually want to monitor, I want to benchmark them. So I started with some students, a little pet project of mine. I wrote a short Python script where I crawl the statistics from the GitHub profiles of different companies. And then actually to structure it, we make a little graph. So this is very at the early beginning of let's say assessment or benchmark, but you still can see over 100 different open source accounts in Switzerland from Swiss companies, corporations, and so on. So it's all open, obviously, and we all put it on GitHub on this link. By the way, the slides are on slideshare.com on my account, and you can download the slides or on my Twitter account. And so here you can actually add your company as well if it's a Swiss company. So with Siemens, we have to figure out if it's really the Swiss branch contributing to open source or not. If it's the Swiss branch, we'll of course add it to the open source benchmark. And then actually we crawl, I think at the moment that the crawler is broken, but we'll definitely update the GitHub repos. And then we can actually give a big picture on how much open source is produced by Swiss companies, governments, NGOs, and so on, which is quite interesting because it's growing. There are the companies that have huge repositories. So for one company at Finis, they actually have 250 repos, or there's actually one behind here. It's Camp to Camp. They have over 600 or 700 repos. So it's huge open source releasing activities going on at the moment. I did write some articles recently about opening up open source software in Switzerland from companies. So this is here is Camp to Camp with over 700 repositories or other companies contributing a lot of open source. We heard about Exascale before. So they actually release a lot of open source. So this, I think, it's really nice because we see with this benchmark, you get something back as a company also. If you release open source, you have some visibility, some reputation. So if you're the #1 company, that's great. So you can advance and put more open source. Obviously, we can discuss on if the metric is well, if we shouldn't measure this something differently. We definitely will work on that as soon as I have some time. I'll improve the metrics, but nevertheless, I think it's important that we measure at all. So then we can, what you can't measure, it doesn't exist, basically. So this is all about releasing open source. And then the third topic I was interested in actually doing research about is inner source. So have you heard of inner source before? Well, open source in a classical term, and this is also paper I cite here from academics. They open source, it's usually software, and different people or organizations, they contribute from different parts outside of this community to the open source software. Sometimes it's one company, sometimes there are thousands of companies. So with Linux, we know that there are more than 4,000 people contributing regularly to the Linux kernel. There are thousands of companies contributing. So it's a huge open source project. Now, inner source, it's obviously inside one organization. It's not open. So this is the big problem, or the big deficiency of inner source, is that it's only inside. However, I think it's even better to have inside a company a culture for open source mentality than having a closed mind and a closed source mentality, because usually there are spillover effects. Inner source people, they also like open source. So therefore, I'm quite relaxed about this big deficiency of inner source, that it's not open. So the society does not benefit from inner source software in itself at the moment. But usually there are also projects in the inner source movement or in the inner source community which are actually released. So what are the benefits of inner source? We did some research at Roche. We had some interesting research at Roche where we actually looked at how does Roche Diagnostics work with open source inside, and how do they adopt open source development practices inside. And so there is a lot of code reuse. So this is a big advantage, because in the regular big companies, people go protect their repositories and so on, so they don't want to share much of the knowledge and so on. And so this is a big the source code, the openness of the source code inside the organization actually leads to more code reuse, better quality of the software, and also increased intrinsic motivation. So people like more to work inside companies who have inner source principles. And code reuse, for example, is also a very economic argument. So code reuse is number one way to actually reduce cost of software development. So therefore, inner use has very advantages, and then there's also more advanced advantages, meaning that there is also inter-organizational learning, so people know better from other units of the organizations what are their problems, what are their needs, what are their topics they're working on. So there's much better knowledge transfer within the company. Then there is much more efficiency because they can actually reuse things, reinventing the wheel. It actually decreased diversity of software components for similar tasks, so there are less heterogeneous IT systems you have to organize, and there are organizational-wide programming standards so you can implement much easier with inner source practices, and so on. So this research was very interesting because it opened up a whole new world also to me. There is more research, mainly from Dirk Riele. He's a professor in Germany. He researched about inner source as well. So he did research about how actually flow of patches within these different companies, within one company, within the different units is actually flowing. So they actually measured lots of different contribution patterns of inner source. So there's still a lot of research going on in the inner source movement, because here it's usually not so open. So you have to have access to a company. Maybe at Siemens, we can do one day some inner source research activity inside. And then there is also inner source commons. So if you want to learn about what is inner source, how can you use these practices, I recommend innersourcecommons.org. There are long-term open source veterans, ladies from the open source movement from the early days, leading this initiative. I can really recommend that because there are many people inside this inner source community of inner source commons. Yeah, so what's next? What can I recommend to you? I can recommend that you join actually the release of the open source report in about 3 weeks from now. Hopefully we'll meet, I probably assume we'll meet in Zurich for some beer. So Roger actually said he will be there. So if you want to meet Roger from Siemens, he will be there. And I am too. And then there's also a hybrid version. So if you want to relax in your home office still, and you still love your home office, as many of you do, so you can actually watch the presentation also from your home office. So you can register on our Uni Berne website, and then you are all at the heart of the open source trends 2021. And actually there are short presentations by different activists or different professionals from open source movements. So there's a very nice event. I'm really looking forward for this one. Another thing, what's next is the new open source directory. Who of you knows the open source directory? So oasisdirectory.com, this is a platform where all the different communities and also projects and companies and users of open source join, and actually they can publish their open source activities. So the platform, the goal of the platform is and was and is to make open source more visible, because visibility is one of the major problems in the open source movement. So companies like Microsoft or Apple, they have big marketing and sales units. Open source doesn't. So therefore, we at CH Open invented the OSIS directory 10 years ago. We implemented it in a very old-fashioned, we implemented it in a new platform back then, but we didn't update it for many years. And now it's almost online. You can test it on testoasisdirectory.com, the new OSIS directory platform. And I really hope you like it, because here you can get some news, some feeds, some vendors, some products, some success stories, events, everything also in English, in French, and in German. So We put a lot of effort inside behind it. It's a very nice graph database, Neo4j with GraphQL and API and so on. So it's a really nice technical approach we tried here, but it takes a little bit longer than I expected to until we go online with this one. And then open source, if you like it also for video conferencing. If you don't like Zoom or Teams and so on, I recommend to use our big blue button platform, bbb.chopen.ch. It's over 2,500 people are registered now. There were over 30,000 meetings during the Corona pandemic, and there was also a nice review in the IT magazine. So it's really stable. It works for many hundreds of participants in one session even. So you can also do big conferences on that one, or also small meetings. So it's all open source on Swiss service, hosted by Green. And next, some more outlook. So tomorrow we have a conference about data colonialism. Data colonialism, where is actually it's more an abstract level, academic level maybe, but actually it addresses the same things. We have the problems also with the vendor lock-in. So vendor lock-in is also a topic of tomorrow's presentation about data colonialism and digital sustainability. You can watch that online, of course. Yeah, so it's said everything. Join the movement. In Switzerland, it's CH Open. I invite you to join. Siemens is already part of the group, and looking forward to get to know each other. Hopefully soon some events personally. So great. This is it. Max, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was nice to see some insights also from a non-technical perspective about this whole open source and inner source topic. And also thanks for the plugs, I guess, for CH Open, yeah, right? If you're interested, feel free to join, yeah. Little insight maybe, you mentioned Roche before. We actually talked with the Roche people at our open source event in the past in Zug about CodeSiemens.com, and that actually inspired them to build code.roche.com. So just a little insight there.
Code.roche.com, I will have to look at that.
Yeah, it's closed. It's inner source only.
Ah, okay. So I cannot.
And I haven't found a way in either. So yeah,
better not.
Yeah, maybe not. And also the other point is that we have also inner source, right? And we have also projects that are reused inside the company by up to 500 other projects. So we have also internal reuse. And the other question you also had to us, I guess, who manages the Siemens account? And this is actually managed by us. It was created in 2010.
Cool.
And we still manage it, and we want to automate this more. At the moment, it's a lot of manual things, I guess. But in the future, we want to also manage this automatically with infrastructure as code and things like that.
Cool. No, I really like that because it's definitely more than just the regular job you do, and this is really cool for the open source, global open source movement.
Yeah. And we also got questions. There was just one coming in from Tony. Which differences do you see in open source projects spread across Europe? Which countries lead the topics? Is there a tendency measurable?
Yeah, that's a very hard one. So frankly, I didn't do research about different countries. So I cannot give a scientifically grounded response to that. I see there's a lot of open source going on in many European countries. So especially Germany, they do a lot. So we're in contact with many German people. France, they are very, they love open source. There's actually an organization, Appel. There is a more European organization where different local, national organizations, they join on an international level. There are Open Forum Europe and so on. So I meet regularly. I'm also one of the lobbyists for open source. So we meet sometimes in Brussels at the FOSDEM conference. So, but other than that, it's more qualitative insights I have, not quantitative.
Yeah, very interesting, indeed. Yeah. The other question we got from Balz, how important do you think are open source contributions policy of a company to its reputation as an employee and as a service provider?
Another very good question. So I think it's very good if the company has some policy, because it actually helps the developers to feel safe about contributing and so on. So I think you definitely have something like that at Siemens. Otherwise, it's difficult in a big company. Of course, in a smaller company, you don't need that. But if it's a bigger international brand, and if managers want to control everything, then they definitely have some policies. We actually asked also in the open source report 2021 if the respondents actually they already contribute open source. So about 1/3 of the respondents, they said yeah they do. And actually then they do. We asked, why do you contribute open source? And one of the options was actually to say it's for recruiting reasons. However, interestingly, it's not so high in the ranking. I don't remember the exact number. I'll show it on the 17th of June, but it was more the reputation thing and getting feedback and so on. So it's not yet, but I know from big companies they do mainly for recruiting reasons. So actually they can see the profiles of the GitHub developers and so on. So I think it's a very big advantage, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Most likely, it definitely helps. Yeah. The other question is from Fabio. It's really awesome to see that open source usage increased that much. How do you see the current state of open source contributions, use versus contribute within Switzerland?
Well, I think you cannot compare, because it's really something different. So imagine how much you like open source using. It's rather comparing using open source versus proprietary software on the client or for the databases and so on. I think this is something you can compare. However, contributing is just a different perspective on the whole thing. So contributing has different motivations. So why do companies contribute software? Because of recruiting, because of reputation, because of feedback, because of innovation, and so on. So the different motives. I was really astonished to see that there are over 100 corporate accounts and organizational accounts on GitHub from Swiss companies. So this is really very nice, and I really would like to have more time. Time is short, but to have some more time to research that, because I think this is a very interesting type of research, and growing also, because they're definitely growing on and on with the number of repositories and number of lines of code and so on.
Yeah, it might also be that a lot of companies are just using local folks and that instead of contributing back.
I think that's okay. I think that's okay that people, first of all, they use open source. Mm-hmm. But there is also the joining script. So people who use open source and then they use it strategically, they more and more are interested in actually joining the discussion. First, they maybe report some bugs, or maybe they report some contribution with the documentation. So we at the University of Berne, we use Hitobito, an open source address management tool. So first of all, first we just used it. We didn't contribute back, but then actually we realized, we want to have this and that feature. So actually we started to work on that, to improve the documentation. Now we do some further development and so on. So I think it's okay to join outside, from outside, and getting closer to the core of the community.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Thomas. What do you think about a company policy of why should not be open source? So open source unless there are good reasons not to. So reverse the current state of practice.
I didn't get that.
So today, I think also in Siemens, we don't open source by default. But the question is about why not open source by default, and then think about why why should this certain thing not be open source? What do you think about this statement?
I think it makes sense in the governmental area where actually taxpayers pay for software for everything which is done by the government. So there's this Free Software Foundation Europe activity, open. I just forgot the claim. Free. No, I don't remember the claim. So make public money, public code. So now, public money, public code is a campaign by the Free Software Foundation Europe. So actually, I also believe governments should be forced basically to open up by default, and they only close it if it's not appropriate. However, in the private sector, source code development, source code is still an asset, so it's intellectual property. So there's a strong legitimation for companies, for private companies, to keep their intellectual property for themselves and then actually open up if it benefits for them. Because frankly, there is Google contributing a lot, or Facebook contributing a lot, or Netflix, but they don't do it for world peace or anything else. So they do it for business reasons. So, and this is okay because they are companies, they want to earn money, Siemens as well. So no bad feelings about that. However, on the government side, I think there is a claim and also the right of the citizens to demand that software is open.
Yeah, that also helps with later if the solution isn't supported anymore, right? So some other company can pick it up. That also helps the public sector. So unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. But thank you very much, Matthias, for the interesting presentation. Also from a non-technical standpoint, more philosophical, I guess. But that's always good, yeah. That's good to think about these things.